Hello and welcome to the second day of Politico's Competitive Europe Summit. To recover or not to recover? That is the question that we'll be dissecting in so many interesting speakers and panels today. My name is Paola Tamma, I'm a reporter with Politico Europe, and you're watching Politico Live. Once again, I'd like to thank our presenting partners, Cefic, CISPE, Generali, Google, and the Polish Economic Institute for making this event possible. Before we dive right in, just a couple of housekeeping rules. You can ask questions and answer our polls only through our swap card app, so download that if you haven't already, the instructions for which you can find on our event's website. If you are already on the app, you can already chat with your fellow attendees and ask questions in the chat box to the right of your screen and below the live stream if you're viewing on your mobile. You will also have the opportunity to answer polls at the beginning of most panel discussions. We want to make this event as interactive as possible, so please don't hesitate to tweet about it with the hashtag Politico Competition. Now, I'd like to kick things off with this year's Competitive Europe Summit opening interview with Nadia Calviño, who is Vice President of Spain and a minister responsible for the economy and digitalization. Welcome, Minister, and thanks for being here.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Just note that due to a change in the Vice President's agenda, we had to pre-record this interview a day early, which means you won't be unfortunately able to ask questions during this session. But we encourage you to interact with each other in the chat box during the broadcast and add further on the topics that we're bringing up in this interview. Voila, let's dive right in. Minister, 2 weeks ago, the Commission has endorsed Spain's recovery plan, calling it ambitious and far-sighted. And pending approval by the Council, you're slated to get nearly 70 billion euros in grants over a 6-year period, making you the second largest beneficiary of the facility following Italy. And to get that money, you will have to carry out a significant number of investment and reforms over the next 6 years, 50 of which already in the remainder of this year. We'll get to those in a minute, but first of all, I wanted to ask you one simple question. Imagine that it's 2026, and we have done it. What is the single one achievement that we must have gotten, that we must have checked in order to call this exercise a success? In other words, how can we judge Spain's recovery? By which meter?
Well, that's a very good question. Indeed, the recovery plans generally aim at achieving a triple objective. First of all, to boost and sustain the recovery after the big hit that we took due to the pandemic. Secondly, to try to launch a process of reform and transformation and modernization of the European economy. And then thirdly, in the long run, to have a more sustainable growth pattern, more inclusive, more sustainable from the economic and financial point of view, but also from the social and environmental point of view. So looking back, I am persuaded that if we do things the right way in 2026, we will be able to look back and see that in 2020 and 2021, we took the right decisions. We chose and had a vision about the right investments, and we took the right steps to ensure that the European economy has a more sustained and sustainable growth pattern going forward.
The European Commission estimates that the plan will bring up to 2.5 additional GDP points, and that's only factoring the investments. If we speak of reforms, the growth impact will be much larger over a much longer period of time. Speaking of which, your government has committed to tackle significant structural problems of Spain, and you're also front-loading reforms, bringing them forward to the first 2 years of the existence of this package. On Monday, you clenched a deal with unions and employers on a reform of the pension system, which was one of Brussels' top asks, and required substantial negotiations, including with your coalition partners, Unidas Podemos. You will now have to do the same for the labor market reform and a number of many others. My question is, we spoke about the plan on paper. The challenge now is implementing it. How confident are you that you will be able to pass these reforms in Parliament, where your coalition holds no majority?
Well, there are many questions in one. Let me turn back a second and showcase Spain, because I think Spain is an example of a success story in terms of the growth that was achieved through the accession to the EU, then also a good use of EU structural funds that made the country invest in top-notch infrastructures, both physical but also digital infrastructures. And I think that now we're facing a similar opportunity for the country to take a big leap forward and really profit from this opportunity, this occasion, to undertake a significant reform project, a program of ambition, as you said a moment ago, from the quantitative point of view, by investing wisely these almost 70 billion in transfers, which we're planning to invest in the coming couple of years. Also, from a qualitative point of view, by undertaking the reforms that have been delayed for many years and that should tackle the imbalances that have been dragging growth for decades in some instances. And also from the time point of view, because we want to concentrate these investments and reforms in the first phase of the recovery plan, because the pandemic has hit the Spanish economy very strongly, and we really need to do these reforms now if we want to launch a new cycle, a growth phase of the new cycle on the right track. Now, implementation is obviously a challenge. I think it's going to be a challenge for everyone. But yet again, Spain has a good track record. And for the last 3 years, with a relatively segmented parliament, we have been able to already prepare and pass a number of reforms. And I am confident that we will be able to also make important steps in the coming months and in this period of a couple of years, this window of opportunity for structural reforms, future-oriented, and which achieve this triple objective I was referring to a moment ago.
Thanks for the answer. I wanted to ask you, there is a history of Brussels asking reforms of national capitals through the European semester and not only. So far, let's say the results are a mixed bag, but this time there is money on the table, which kind of changes the balance and forces you to take these steps if the money is to arrive to national capitals. However, there is also a precedent, at least in Spain and some other countries, of reforms being requested of Spain in exchange of a bailout. Not such a faraway precedent, but we're just talking about the last 10 years. Is there a risk, you think, of difficult reforms being asked of Spain and these being perceived as an imposition from Brussels? And what is this risk?
Well, actually, we have a fortunate kind of coalition. The planets are aligned in a way, because the agenda that we've been following since we took office in June 2018, which we called at the time the Agenda for Change, is the embryo, is the basis for our recovery plan. And this is a transformative agenda, future-oriented, very much axed on green, digital, social and territorial cohesion and gender equality, which has inspired, as I said, the recovery plan, and which is fully aligned not only with the country-specific recommendations we have got from the European institutions for the last years, but also with the international agenda. You know, this objective of inclusive and sustainable growth is totally aligned with the national agenda that we've been pursuing and that marks our priorities going forward. And there is a very large social consensus on the need to undertake these reforms, because there is a conviction that the moment has come to try to tackle these imbalances that have been generating problems for Spain, not only in terms of dragging growth, but also dragging prosperity, increasing inequalities, making the labor market not function properly, and then leading to poor workers, child poverty. We need to tackle these challenges, and I think that the recovery plan is a great opportunity to do that now.
Thanks again. There is one challenge which we haven't talked about. You spoke of Spain being a success story and using EU money for useful things, infrastructure and digital infrastructure. However, Spain over the past has had a bad record of tapping the EU structural funds. Over the last budget cycle, it had less than 50% of the money to which it was entitled to, largely due to not requesting it in time and not spending it in time. Now, on top of the regular EU funds, there will be these additional 70 billion in grants to spend in an even shorter period of time. So where exactly is the problem in spending EU money in Spain, and what is the government doing to avoid this bad rate?
Well, obviously, after the first phase of the structural funds where we heavily invested in infrastructures, I think the last cycle has made it more challenging because now we're talking about smart growth, we're talking about R&D, smaller projects, and this is more difficult to implement smoothly. There was also a big delay in terms of implementation due to the financial crisis. But Spain, if I may describe it this way, is slow but sure. We will implement 100% when the period finishes. We have been probably taking more time than other countries that were more focused on the infrastructures that Spain has already achieved, a decade before. Now, going forward, I think that indeed we will have the structural funds, we will also have the recovery plan, but the two have a relatively different nature. Because structural funds have a territorial cohesion approach, they are regionalized, so it is the regions that are going to undertake those investments, which need to be, of course, fully consistent and complementary to those of the recovery plan. But the recovery plan has a different magnitude and also a different kind of aim, which has a more macroeconomic material impact. We want to undertake these reforms and also large investments, key projects, significant projects that can really lead to a transformation at the national level. And so I think that the two will interact in a positive manner, but I do not see necessarily that there would be a challenge in terms of implementing the two, as they should both go in the same direction, of course.
Thank you, and good luck with spending this money. It's not just about spending it, of course, but spending it well. And in that regard, one of the key requirements of the Recovery and Resilience Facility is to have strong and independent oversight of the funding so that it doesn't fall prey to corruption and organized crime. I have one question, which is, you have been in the past a Director General of DG Budget, so working kind of on the other side. And on the one hand, today the Commission is assessing the spending plans of countries, including countries in which it has ongoing legal political disputes on the rule of law, such as Hungary and Poland. And on the other hand, it has been reluctant to deploy so far newly agreed powers conditioning EU funding to the respect of the rule of law. My question is, with somebody with your background, should the Commission keep these two things separate? Or in separating these two debates, is Brussels depriving itself of leverage vis-à-vis Budapest and Warsaw?
Well, this is a very delicate question. I would say that the Spanish position on this is that we absolutely need to ensure the rule of law throughout the EU. Our values, our principles, and the respect for individual and collective rights and the well-functioning of the economic and political governance of countries, this is one of the key features of the European project. This is what makes Europe one of the beacons of freedom throughout the world, and we need to preserve it. So I think we should use all the different tools to try to ensure that. And I am sure, that through the different means and the different procedures that exist, pressure and will be ensured so that we protect our core values. I have heard recent statements by President von der Leyen, which are very clearly going in this direction, and I think this approach is fully aligned also to the European Parliament, and that probably will be the leading voice, if you wish, on this issue going forward.
Thanks. I'll push it just a little bit more. Should we give them the money before we achieve something else on the other hand? That is a very blunt question of whether this money, the recovery money, should be used as leverage in this debate, do you think?
Well, actually, I haven't quite reflected on this much because we are very focused right now on the approval of the recovery plans in the July ECOFIN, and I haven't reflected on whether this should in itself be linked to the rule of law debate. What I think is that we need to ensure that all countries are fully compliant with the rule of law principles. It wouldn't make sense to launch an ambitious investment program, which at the end of the day is not preserving the core values that are leading the European project.
Thanks for that. I wanted to be a bit broader in our discussion now and moving on to economic debates which are linked but separate from the recovery fund. I wanted to ask you about your budget and the future of the European budget. So Spanish media reported that you're preparing next year's budget and you foresee 125% of GDP ratio in 2022, which is the highest in your Republican history. Just a year before Growth and Stability Pact, which limits that debt to GDP ratio to 60%, is due to be reinstated. And the Commission has committed itself to revisiting the rules. It will present a proposal for new rules in the fall, but the extent to which they will be changed and in what way is the subject of intense debate. We have heard statements from both Dutch caretaking Prime Minister Mark Rutte and the CDU's candidate to become Germany's next Chancellor, Armin Laschet, argue that we should return to strong fiscal discipline. And on the other hand, arguments from France and Italy that we can't go back to the rules as they were. So far, however, Spain hasn't spoken out in public. What is Spain's position in this debate?
Well, two issues. First of all, just to clarify that actually the debt to GDP ratio in Spain is below 100%, just below. And we hope that it will start to go down already in 2021. Thanks to the very strong growth which is foreseen for this year, I think Spain is going to be the fastest growing economy in 2021, 2022, at least. This is what all the national and international forecasting institutions are foreseeing. And thanks to this growth, what we have submitted in our stability plan is a forecast that we will start reducing our deficit to GDP ratio and our debt to GDP ratio already in 2021. I just wanted to clarify this. Now, on the fiscal rules, another issue I should flag is that Olaf Scholz is also a candidate to become the chancellor in Germany. So, you know, I think whatever he says is also very relevant in this debate. But from the Spanish point of view, we think that the rules that we have set for ourselves were decided and agreed in a very different economic context. And the economy has changed very much since then. And actually, these rules were not really fit for purpose before the pandemic hit us. Every year we had to submit papers and discuss, you know, how to fit the rules into the reality. At least this was the case with Spain, but I think it's the same in many other countries. So I think it would be wise to review these rules before we go back to the normal situation, before we exit the exceptional situation of the exceptional framework that we have agreed upon as a result of the pandemic. It's not urgent, but I am sure that the European Commission is going to continue to pursue the review process that they had already launched. And it would be good that we make sure that when we go back to the normal times, the rules are really fit for purpose and they reflect the reality, and they are also simpler and easier to identify. The fact that the methodologies that we're following are based on non-observable variables, which are really very complicated to agree upon and do not reflect the real situation of the countries. I think that makes them also less credible, less explainable to normal citizens. We need to have rules which are understandable and can be followed and reflect our targets and our discipline, which of course we should preserve and respect going forward. This is a key principle, but we should give ourselves the best rules to achieve those objectives and try to do the review before we exit the exceptional situation we're in right now.
I think I've captured a criticism of the output gap just in there in between the lines, but I wanted to ask you, what exactly does it mean to have rules fit for purpose? So within keeping the treaties, and nobody is speaking of a change of the treaties, these two limits, the 3% and the 60%, are going to stay. What some people are arguing for is a reduction of the pace to which countries are required to go back to the 60% rule, and perhaps a distinction between current expenditure and then the investments in GDP, so that these could be preserved even in a situation of high debt. And then you mentioned, without mentioning it, the output gap. So could you give us maybe, in 3 sentences, what are the 3 things that Spain would like to change, if it's possible?
Well, let me say something which is more technical and then something a bit more political. From the technical point of view, I think indeed that the output gap, but the whole methodology that we have been developing for years is really complicated. It's based on non-observable variables. It cannot really be explained. It gets too complicated to calculate. There is too many disagreements. I think we should keep it a bit simpler, you know, so that we can easily understand where we are in terms of the fiscal discipline and the responsibility of the different countries. So that's from the technical point of view, and there will be a lot of technical work and debates in the coming months, and we will see where that leads us. But from a more political point of view, I have been for the last weeks and months flagging an issue which I think is a wake-up call for all of us. Since Spain was having a public investment around 4 or 5% of GDP before the financial crisis hit us, that's in 2008. Since it dropped to 2%, and it never got back. It means that some years the public sector in Spain was not investing enough to preserve those wonderful infrastructures that we have in the country. And that is obviously weakening our ability to grow in a sustainable manner going forward. Not to speak about the maintenance of public capital, which is not only the roads and stations and airports and the digital networks, it is also the schools and the hospitals. And I think that this pandemic has shown that investment is a top priority for all of us if we want to make a stronger Europe and to have a strong growth going forward. And so we definitely need to make sure that our fiscal rules are not weakening our ability to invest, particularly in the coming years when we need to make these huge public and private investments in order to achieve the very ambitious objectives we have, which we fully support, on the green, digital, and the digital agenda. And that we also try to reduce inequalities, which had, by the way, also increased a lot since the financial crisis in many countries, amongst which Spain. So from the more political point of view and from the more long-term point of view, I think this debate about investment is certainly one that we need to have.
And if we speak about the European economic governance, in the long term, we cannot but ask ourselves, is there going to be a recovery fund too? The permanent edition. So this recovery fund was agreed on the premises that it will be only a one-off instrument. It was a precondition for many EU countries to sign up to this last July, over a year ago. But there has already been talk about perhaps making some elements of this permanent, and specifically in order to to create an EU asset and to complete the EU economic governance with a fiscal union, in the words of Prime Minister Mario Draghi, but then also in the words of ECB President Christine Lagarde, to be able to have some counter-cyclical firepower should another crisis arrive. So what I wanted to ask is when and if we should start this debate about having a fiscal union.
Well, first of all, I want to pay tribute to the European response to the pandemic. I think that the response to this crisis has been so different to the previous financial crisis. Starting last spring, when in the Eurogroup we agreed to set up new mechanisms, for example, the new shore mechanism, which has proven to be a very useful stabilizing factor, because it has provided some countries, those that have been most severely hit, with financing at good conditions. These are loans, this is debt, but at good financing conditions. And that has allowed us to set up a safety net which has minimized, has really dampened the negative impact of the crisis, compared to the previous financial crisis. And Spain is again a case at stake, because we have been able to protect jobs, to protect the productive tissue, to protect family income. And that has allowed us to have a good basis now for the recovery to be strong and minimize also the social damage created by the pandemic. So the European response has been the right one, and the Recovery Fund is definitely a totally new instrument. We're going to issue debt, borrow together, to invest together in our common future. And I think this is a totally different response from the technical, but more importantly, from the political point of view. Now, let's get it right. I think we have to be committed to making this a success. This should be our top priority. And I think this should be the priority also in terms of debates. Let's get the fund rolling. Let's get the recovery plans implemented. And then we can reflect on whether or not to make some of these instruments permanent. We already see that some of them have been extremely successful, like SURE, in terms of a stabilizing element for the whole of the EU. And we have to go on reflecting along the same lines. But I'd say this is not an urgent debate that we should be having in the coming months.
Thank you for that. So you will not be hassling the men who won you to the race of Eurogroup president in order to have a recovery fund too, at least for the coming months?
Well, I don't think that is a top priority on the Eurogroup agenda anyway. Pascal has already outlined his agenda, which I very much agree with. I think banking union is probably something that we should be discussing, the review of the fiscal rules. There are many priorities on our agenda, starting with the approval and implementation of the recovery plans. And so we have a lot in our plate without opening up debates which are maybe not so urgent right now.
Thank you so much, Vice President. Thank you for being with us and for this enlightening conversation. And to sum it up, I would say that Spain very much understands the responsibility that is placed on Madrid with the 70 billions, and it's fully committed to the reform agenda. There will be challenges in the implementation, as ensuring that it's spent in full, that it's spent well, and that it's spent according to the rules. And on the other hand, while there is a necessity to start thinking about the fiscal rules and preserving space for investments, there is not a necessity to kickstart talks about a recovery fund number 2, in the words of Nadia Calviño. Thank you so much again for being with us. And I wanted to ask all of you from the audience to join my colleague Giorgio Leali at 9:40 a.m. CEST for our next spotlight discussion on strategic autonomy, featuring a top lineup of speakers on a debate on a very hot topic. Stay tuned, and thank you.